Today I'm going to read another segment on the foundations of Bentham's utilitarianism. The reason being, I want you to understand about ethics. It is interesting, but there's a whole lot more to it than just thinking. Hi, I'm Dr. Simpson, and welcome to Learn with GS. This channel is geared towards educating persons who are interested in introductory college courses and advanced placement high school courses through reading textbooks. So, classes have started. Let's continue reading on ethics. Jeremy Bentham, do you know him? He was the first of what would be called the classical utilitarians. Driven by a genuine desire for social reform, Bentham wanted to be as much involved in law, politics, and economics as abstract philosophizing. Bentham developed his moral theory of utilitarianism on the foundation of the type of hedonistic thinking described in Section 2. For Bentham, the only thing that determines the value of a life, or indeed the value of an event or action, is the amount of pleasure contained in that life or the amount of pleasure produced as a result of that event or action. Bentham is a hedonistic utilitarian. This belief in hedonism, however, was not something that Bentham took to be unjustified or arbitrary. For him, hedonism could be empirically justified by evidence in the world in its favor. According to Bentham, he said, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do." Bentham moves from this empirical claim about the factors that guide our behavior to a normative claim about how we ought to live. He creates a moral theory based on the bringing about of more pleasure and less pain. When first understanding utilitarianism, it is also crucial to understand what is meant by the term utility. Bentham defined it as the property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness. Utility is thus promoted when pleasure is promoted and when unhappiness is avoided. Bentham's commitment to hedonism means for him that goodness is just an increase in pleasure and evil or unhappiness is just an increase in pain or decrease in pleasure. With this understanding of utility in mind, Bentham commits himself to the principle of utility. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or, what is the same thing in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. In effect, this principle simply says that promoting utility, defined in terms of pleasure, is to be approved of and reducing utility is to be disapproved. The principle of utility, backed by a commitment of hedonism, underpins the central utilitarian claim made by Bentham. Based on a phrase that he wrongly attributed to Joseph Priestley, Bentham suggests that the measure of right and wrong is the extent to which an action produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Of course, what counts as good for Bentham is pleasure. We can then rephrase what Bentham himself called his fundamental axiom as a requirement to promote the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people in order to act morally. The structure of Bentham's utilitarianism. In addition to being hedonistic, Bentham's utilitarianism is also 1. Consequentialist, teleological, 2. Relativist, 3. Maximizing, and 4. Impartial. Bentham's utilitarianism is consequentialist because the moral value of an action or event is determined entirely by the consequences of that event. The theory is also described as teleological for the same reason, based on the Greek word teleos that means end or purpose. If more pleasure follows as a consequence of action A rather than action B, then according to the fundamental axiom of utilitarianism, action A should be undertaken and is morally right. Choosing action B would be morally wrong. In addition, Bentham's utilitarianism is relativistic rather than absolutist. Absolutist moral views hold that certain actions will always be morally wrong irrespective of context or consequences. For example, many campaigning groups suggest that torture is always morally unacceptable whether it is carried out by vindictive dictators seeking to instill fear in a population or whether it is authorized by democratically elected governments seeking to obtain information in order to stop a terrorist attack. For absolutists, then, the act of torture is absolutely wrong in all cases and situations. Clearly, Bentham cannot hold this type of view because sometimes the pain involved in torture may lead to the promotion of greater pleasure or less intense pain overall, such as in the case where torture stops a terrorist atrocity. On this basis, the Benthamite utilitarian must believe that whether a certain action is right or wrong is always relative to the situation in which the action takes place. Bentham's utilitarianism is maximizing because it does not merely require that pleasure is promoted, but that the greatest pleasure for the greatest number is secured. This means that some actions that lead to pleasure will still not be morally good acts if another action that could have produced even more pleasure in that setting was rejected. Thus, for example, if you gain some pleasure from spending money on a new book, but that money could have produced more pleasure had it been donated to a local charity for the homeless, then buying a new book would be morally wrong even though it led to some pleasure because it did not maximize the total amount of pleasure that was possible in that circumstance. Finally, Bentham's utilitarianism is also impartial in the sense that what matters is simply securing the maximum amount of pleasure for the maximum number of people. The theory does not give special preference regarding which people are supposed to have access to or share in that total pleasure. Bentham's utilitarian theory is associated with the idea of equal consideration of interests. As long as total pleasure is maximized, then it does not matter if that pleasure is experienced by royalty, presidents, siblings, children, friends, or enemies. In the total calculation of pleasure, we are all equal, regardless of our status, behavior, or any other social factor. Hedonic Calculus. Hopefully, it is now clear that for Bentham, the consequences in terms of pleasure production of any action are what determine the morality of that action, and that no other factors are relevant. However, it is not clear how exactly we should go about working out what to do in specific cases. For example, you are a military airman flying a fighter jet that is about to intercept a passenger airline that seems to have been hijacked by an as yet unknown figure. The plane appears to be on a path that could take it either to an airport or potentially directly to a major and highly populated city. You are tasked with deciding how to act and must therefore choose whether or not to fire a missile at that plane. Firing at the plane would kill the passengers but save all lives on the ground. Yet not firing may save the passengers, or it may give the passengers only a few more minutes before the plane is flown into a city full of innocents and they are killed in any case. Suggesting that the pilot weigh up the options and choose the action that secures the greatest pleasure for the greatest number is not obviously helpful in making such a difficult decision with so many variables. Bentham recognized that such problems of calculation relating to the pleasure associated with future actions needed addressing in order for utilitarianism to be a workable moral theory. Bentham therefore created the Hedonic Calculus, sometimes known as the Felicific Calculus, in order to help an individual work out how much pleasure would be created by differing possible actions. The Hedonic Calculus, as suggested by Bentham, is based on assessing possible pleasure according to their 1. Intensity, 2. Duration, 3. Certainty, 4. Remoteness, that is, how far into the future the pleasure is, 5. Fecundity, that is, how likely it is that pleasure will generate other related pleasures, 6. Purity, as in if any pain will be felt alongside that pleasure, and 7. Extent, how many people might be able to share in that pleasure. The hedonic calculus is therefore supposed to provide a decision procedure for a utilitarian who is confused as to how to act in a morally tricky situation. Thus, our fighter pilot might consider the intensity of the pleasure of surviving versus the duration of the pain of death, while also needing to balance these factors against the relative certainty of the possible pains or pleasures. No doubt, the fighter pilot would still face an agonizing moral choice, but it seems that he would at least have some methodology for working out what utilitarianism morally requires of him. In our next section, we'll read Problems with Bentham's Utilitarianism.